Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair, and joining me once more today is Khurram Husain. Khurram needs no introduction. He's been a frequent member, I think the most frequent guest on this podcast. And whenever there's a macroecon issue that I need to talk about, Khurram is my first port of call. Today, we're going to be talking about a couple of things, but primarily focusing on an excellent piece Khurram wrote a couple of weeks ago now in Dawn called Extracting Dollars. The full link to that piece is in the description. But it relates to this conversation that at least those of us who follow Pakistan's economy have picked up on in the last month or so, I believe, which is about this growing shortage of dollars in the market. And what does that mean? I think if you've been following the news, you've seen that money changers were, sort of hauled back in, so to speak, to talk about this issue and the divergence in the open market and the black market and what's going on is the talk of town in many econ circles now. Khurram wrote an excellent piece about trying to explain to us what exactly has happened and what's going on. So, Khurram, welcome back to Pakistonomy and thank you for taking out the time today.
Thank you very much for the invitation. Glad to be here as always.
Khurram, so I want to begin with sort of something very interesting you lay out in your piece, which is that, in Pakistan's cycle, which we've talked about quite a bit, you go from overheating to crisis to stabilization. And the typical cycle is that from stabilization, the pathway is then very quickly laid for another cycle of overheating, which people define as growth chahiye hame, right? What you define in your piece now is that we kind of have moved from overheating and stabilization into something very unique now, at least and correct me if my interpretation of this is wrong, but something unique, which is over extraction. Help us understand what do you mean by over extraction? And from your perspective, is this something new that has happened in terms of the economic cycle in Pakistan?
Well, your second question, no, it's not new. We've seen the same thing happen in previous episodes. But Uzair, it's telling, though, isn't it, that we have a vocabulary, we have a word, we have the conceptual apparatus, we have the data to feed the analytics to describe a situation where an economy grows beyond its capacity to sustain, right? And we call that overheating. And we've got all the metrics by which to measure whether this sort of a thing is happening laid out to us. Such an economy will start experiencing high levels of inflation. It will have full capacity utilization domestically, but the levels of demand obtaining within it will be beyond what its domestic economy can sustain. As a result, it will furnish the goods and services required to service the incremental demand via imports. And if it's foreign exchange reserves, if it's productivity levels versus its competitors, if it's exports and overall health of its trade balance cannot sustain the incremental demand that will fuel imports, that economy will begin to overheat. It will experience inflation. It will experience a deterioration of its foreign exchange reserves until finally it lands up in the middle of a balance of payments crisis and needs an external bailout if course correction does not take place. All this is very familiar to us by now, right? We've all been talking about it for years. We've seen Pakistan go through this cycle many times by now. But the other side, for that, we don't have the language. We don't have the conceptual vocabulary. We don't really have it really worked out that clearly of what happens when an economy remains stagnant for a protracted period of time, when it does not grow, and new entrants keep being added to the labor force, where income levels fail to keep pace with increase in prices. If it cannot create the jobs required to meet new entrants into the labor force, if it cannot arrange for incomes to rise in accordance with and keep standards of living at least at pace with where the price level is going, what happens inside that economy? And I find this interesting because I think it sort of speaks to a bit of a gap in how the apparatus of mainstream economics is built. I know this sounds like really like I'm putting a lot on one plate, But this is why I had to actually use or come up with my own word, which I'm using tentatively until a better word can be brought about. That's what we are seeing happen now in Pakistan. We've seen that when you pump growth in this economy, we've seen that happen before. We've seen what all happens when you do that. But what happens when you stabilize the economy and you keep it in that stabilization mode for a protracted period of time without any hint of a breakout into growth in the near future? That's what we are seeing happen right now. And my answer to that question, which I'll admit is tentative for now, it's floated more by way of starting a conversation of the sort that you are doing right now. My tentative answer to that question is that when such a stabilization mode is carried on for a long period of time, without any breakout into growth, into resumption of growth, the state itself becomes over extractive, meaning it becomes maybe obsessed is the wrong word, but it becomes preoccupied with arranging the revenues and the foreign exchange resources required for its own needs, not for the needs of the private sector and not for the needs of the citizenry, but for its own needs as such. And just sort of, and that's where Pakistan is at right now. It's gone into an over extractive mode, and this is what happens when you stabilize without any kind of a reform agenda on the horizon, or a reform agenda taking shape in the background. Because the whole idea of these stabilization episodes that we are currently in, that we entered into in July 2023 with a standby arrangement that was suddenly announced back then, if you remember. The whole idea behind these stabilization measures is that you undertake the stabilization just long enough to extinguish your fiscal and external sector deficits. And once they are done, you use that time period to bring about the reforms on the back of which you then restart growth once the deficits have been extinguished. If you don't undertake those reforms, then those can relate to tax reforms, to harvest the next generation of incremental revenues. They can include the state-owned enterprises to help bring about the expenditure cuts that will help you meet fiscal deficit targets. Can include many things. But if you're doing nothing on that front and you're only stabilizing the economy, you will extinguish the deficits, but then you will land up in this over-extractive mode where there's no path forward, but you can't keep standing where you're at either. You just sort of stuck in this situation where the ground is getting hot beneath your feet, but you've got nowhere else to go. And that's, I fear, where they've landed up at this point.
And in your piece, you point to this data, right, as part of the evidence, which is that you look at the state banks as net foreign assets, which is basically how much more does the state bank owe or own, depending on the position of the NFAs. And you show that it's basically been a change or an increase of 1.5 trillion rupees over the last few years, where net foreign assets were really negative, and they've shot back into positive territory dramatically over this period of time. And at the same time, you sort of have seen net foreign assets on the commercial bank side become negative, meaning that they have more liabilities on their books as opposed to assets. And that itself is basically the state bank is building reserves. It is running a policy where it cannot allow sort of like permanent deficits being run in the system, and the accumulation of dollars is the primary sort of like goal of the bank itself. When I read that part, it sort of related to me because anecdotally, for example, one of the things I've heard in the last couple of years, right, that the policy making choice in Islamabad and at the central bank from a arithmetic point of view is very simple. The average import level per month cannot go beyond $5 to $6 billion because that is the limit basically at which the equation starts breaking down. Now that the bank has started doing that, what are you beginning to see in the market itself on the private sector side occur as a result of all of this? I would call accumulation of net foreign assets by the state itself.
Well, what we've seen happen in the market is mounting pressure on the FX markets, the foreign exchange markets in this country. And this pressure has sort of always been there. It's in the background. But while imports were contained because of high interest rates and also active, state bank guidance to the banks to say that be careful about opening LCs. A really sort of a lackluster performance in the interbank market and whatnot. The FX markets were already under a great deal of pressure back when the stabilization route was adopted in July 2023. Back then, though, they were near a default level. They're far from that now. But the comfort in the FX markets was not really sufficient to bring about a resumption of growth, because everybody knew that the moment they start to grow the economy again, the moment your idle capacity in the economy begins to operate one more time, the first place to get hit will be these FX markets, because the demand for imports will shoot up, and we may have enough FX cover to meet debt service obligations, but there is certainly not enough left over after that in order to finance the import requirements that will come from a resumption of growth. So that resumption of growth sort of in a very incipient form came a few months ago, somewhere around March, April, May, in those months. And we began to see an uptick in imports in those months. And at the same time, we had some fairly large Chinese debts maturing, totaling between them something like 3.2 or just above $3 billion. And the NFAs actually showed a very sharp drop, the net foreign assets, and then a very sharp rise again as the rollover first, liquidity first went out and then came back in again once the rollover was complete. But now they've sort of been hovering at that level. Now, you're right to pinpoint this as an important crux, because from July 2023, when NF, near default levels, they've risen by about 1.5 trillion. The state, and a large amount of that, at least in the last year, let's say from about July 24 till July 25, something like in the vicinity of $7 billion has been purchased by the state bank from the FX market. So they're really buying up as much of the dollar liquidity as they can and squirreling it away in their own FX reserves. And this is helping them meet IMF targets. In fact, it's helping them meet targets beyond what the targets were set. So we're actually at a point where the state bank is over accumulating above and beyond what was worth looking at in previous programs, where after 1 year of the program, do we have other instances where the central bank overaccumulated above and beyond the requirements? Because that overaccumulation, buying dollars beyond what you are required to by program benchmarks, itself places a cost on the markets. It places a cost on the economy. It's a crowding out of a different kind altogether, where the state is basically taking away the dollar liquidity and not leaving enough behind for the private sector to finance its operations and its import requirements. It would be interesting to see if we've had this happen in the past. But nevertheless, for now, what this does is you've got a slight incipient resumption of imports from the private sector. You've got a state bank that's hungry for dollars, that's buying over and above what its requirements are. And the financial markets are feeling the pressure of all this. And the pressure lands up on the exchange rate, this pressure. Because now the bankers are saying, and the exchange companies are saying, wait a minute, I've got people who are willing to pay me a lot more than 282 rupees for these dollars that I'm bringing in. I'd rather sell to them, actually, rather than sell to you. And you know that because the unofficially known Hundi Hawala rate is, different people they quote different rates, but it's well above the official rate. It's above 292, in fact, more than a 10 rupee gap between. So that means that exchange companies at least are able to say that, look, I've got a black market going here. Okay, people are willing to buy these same dollars off me for a lot more than 282. So I don't feel good selling them at 282, which is the official exchange rate. They start withholding their dollars, offloading them in the black market instead, and the state notices this. The state bank notices this, and we saw about a month ago when the exchange companies were summoned by the military. Right, they even named the ISI official who summoned them in and talked to them about the fact that that dollars are drying up, and they said, well, you've got a black market going in dollars, and the black market only exists when there are people who are willing to pay a lot more for those dollars than what you are being told is the official rate. And it's the same with the banks. But the banks don't really have a recourse to a black market the same way as the exchange companies do. So they're a lot more constrained to continue operating on the rules set by the state bank, and the rules include a very silent, nothing official about it, whisper every morning that goes out via a phone call to the treasury heads of the bank saying, this is today's rate, do not sell above this rate. This is a
Which,
very
if I
standard way.
if I may interrupt you there, right? This is because, some while ago now, when the banks came into the FX markets, the idea that was discussed, right, by many, including us on the sides in private, was that, okay, the banks coming in will provide some level of maturity into this market, and therefore we have better sort of deeper pocketed players operating. And we know exchange companies in Pakistan sort of try to run two books, and there was a lot of coverage in the crisis about all of this as well. Seems like now it's become the same problem again. And as you said, the banks can't go into
Yeah.
the black market the way exchange companies can run two books, etc. But my view, to your point, if I were connecting the dots, right, is okay, so you have this problem of generating growth leading to higher imports, and then that obviously creates the problems that you identified. You have people willing to pay a premium on the currency. The most rational path out, from my perspective, would be to allow a slow and steady decline in the value of the rupee, because it not only makes your exports more competitive, but it reduces the sort of the ability, purchasing power of domestic consumers to import. And that leads to a balancing overall in terms of the overall dynamics in the FX market, as well as your current account deficits. What's the hold up this time around? Because, like, I don't understand why we're back to discussing the same old things that are there related to the peg to the dollar, and why that peg must be maintained through an official communications channel that say 282 or 285 is the range in which you may trade this currency. Like, what's going on again?
Right. Look, short answer, I don't know. Okay, but let's play connect the dots. Okay, because that's how we traditionally then build a picture of what may be happening. So, with the caveat that the following may all be tentative. In fact, it is tentative. Okay, here's what's happening. The state bank is accumulating dollars, buying them beyond its requirement with the benchmark set by the program for itself. This is creating pressures in the FX markets, which is giving rise to black markets, which is necessitating, coercive measures, recourse to coercive measures to try and shut down the black markets. They're trying to keep the exchange rate constant. Now, part of this would be explained simply by the fact that this is the old thinking. As you correctly noted, this is how they've traditionally reacted in such situations. And there is an old thinking in Pakistan which sees the exchange rate as something sacrosanct. That if that is allowed to move, it's an admission of economic weakness. And whereas they've built the entire narrative, economic narrative, at least on having stabilized the economy, a deval at this time would run contrary to that. And people would then say that, well, if the economy is so stable, why is the exchange rate? Why is the rupee sliding versus the dollar? But I think it may go beyond just narrative control. I think they're trying to basically accumulate, because the narrative part alone doesn't explain the overaccumulation. It doesn't explain the voracious appetite of the state bank to accumulate dollars in its chest. I think, and I mean the treasury chest, right? I think part of what may be going on is that following the war in May with India, there are some very important procurements that are coming up. And we know that, for example, some stealth fighter aircraft from China are being procured, delivery for which is supposed to take place in as early as February. I don't know, right, what the date is, but we do know that these things are happening, and there is an upgradation of the um, hardware required to uh, survive through a second wave that everybody says the country needs to be prepared for following the war in May. It's possible that the procurement requirements over here are fueling the appetite for the accumulation of reserves by the state bank. It's possible. This is, of course, without regard to whether this is good or bad. We're simply connecting the dots and trying to figure out the picture of what's happening in the FX markets. And what's happening there, there are two things that need to be explained. One is the mounting pressure, and the other is the appetite of the state bank to continue buying more and more. Um, so let's see. But the fact that there is pressure is undeniable. The fact that um, the only way to really grow out of this pressure, regardless of what the military procurement requirements might be in the future, this is a situation that you would have still landed up in. The procurement requirements might have moved that point further up the timeline. But if those were not there, we would be in a situation like this by, let's say, November, December instead. That's all. They've just added to the pressure. They have not given rise to it. So the fact that we are in this position of over extraction, I think, grows fundamentally out of the inability of the government to use the time that it's been in power to really unroll some kind of a reform agenda and use that time period to bring about some kind of a change. And this is where that situation then brings you. Over stabilization brings you in a situation where you turn extractive, and that harms the economy in its own way. The way excess growth harms the economy through overeating. Um,
Yeah.
so
Yeah,
I'll,
no, I
I'll
think
rest.
and the structural implications of this is perhaps another longer conversation, right? Because we're beginning to see the impacts of this across the board. For me, the biggest impact that at least, and you and I have talked about this with other people as well, is visible in the energy sector. You've gone into stabilization or over extraction for so long now that now there's a structural shift away from the formal energy grid connected energy sector in Pakistan, which has created essentially through solarization in particular a death spiral of the energy grid. And there's no coming back from that, right? Like estimates now suggest over 10 gigawatts of industrial capacity that is behind the grid. Like it's not connected to the grid on the solar side, which means that those consumers are not coming back. In fact, the more you try to extract, the faster they go away from the grid, which means that you're left with stranded assets. And that's a whole, in and of itself, as a sector, a whole problem to manage that I don't think people are connecting this dot, which you started the conversation on over extraction and what happens if you sustain this for too long, because economic actors will find alternative pathways that have implications beyond the FX markets. But that's a separate longer conversation. I want to come to your most recent column, which is 3 years, three uprisings. Full piece connected in the description for those who want to read it, because I connected these two pieces. Because from the point of view what's happened in the region, in Sri Lanka first, then Bangladesh, and now Nepal. And I'm going to be talking to a friend of mine in Nepal tomorrow, hopefully, to figure out what has happened over there exactly and what comes next. But you allude to in your piece, right, that there were real problems that were metastasizing, or sort of the ground was getting hard under people's feet, and all it needed was a trigger, and we ended up there. And then towards the end of that piece, you allude to sort of the situation in Pakistan where you argue that the ingredients are there and there are ways in which this can be triggered, or perhaps the government should pay attention to and not trigger in the way perhaps the Oli government in Nepal did by banning all social media. What do you see over there in terms of what's played out in the region, but also in places like Indonesia, where we've seen protests of a similar kind erupt and the finance minister resign, and this over extraction in Pakistan?
Right. And I think you're very right to link those two. Listen, I'll look out for your Nepal conversation, okay, because I want to add to my knowledge about what's happened to Nepal as well. And it's a bit too soon for me to be making any kind of a call on it. But regarding Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, let me put a couple of observations on the table here between us. And then let's see how those connect. Number one, nobody. Now, Sri Lanka and Bangladesh are two countries that have a fairly decent number of people who are observing that country for analytical purposes from outside. Sri Lanka has a very large external debt component, and for that reason alone, there are a lot of people watching it, and especially since it started undergoing a debt rescheduling. But even before that, even before the default of Sri Lanka, it was under observation from various directions for that reason, and then for its heavy sort of drift into the Chinese orbit, that had brought an analytical spotlight on that country. So there were a lot of people, like you and I watch Pakistan. Well, you watch other countries in addition to Pakistan too, but there were people such as us watching Sri Lanka very carefully. Likewise with Bangladesh. Bangladesh's growth story is, in a sense, has a certain a global dimension to it. And people wanted to know, and big name economists would ask each other, what did Bangladesh get right? That they've had such sustained high growth rates. And as a result, there was a certain spotlight on Bangladesh that kept that country under some amount of observation, people taking a deep dive. Now, note something, despite this, despite so many eyes on both these countries, literally nobody saw it coming. Nobody actually saw the uprising coming. And nobody was able to even, I don't know if anybody was able to sort of vaguely, directionally say, look, it seems like this whole thing is lit to pop. But I couldn't find anyone who was willing to sort of, put that on the record, maybe in private conversations, but nobody was out there being, able to put that on the record. Number one. And same with Nepal. I don't know if there's anyone out there who saw this coming, and we were all rather surprised when it built up the way it did. Number two, in both Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, you have a certain deterioration of the economic situation that is unique to each. So in Sri Lanka, for example, the economic shock that hits the country, you can see it, for example, just to take one example, in fuel prices in that country. So if you look at the adjustments that were taking place in the prices of petrol between the year July 2021 and July 2022, in between these two points on the timeline is the default, right? So in the months preceding and in the months after the default, the price of fuel the price of petrol in Sri Lanka tripled. And if you go back in time from July 2021 backwards to see how long did it take for the price of petrol to triple until July 2021, you end up going back like, something like a couple of decades in time. So here the price of petrol did in 1 year what it took decades to do before that.
And to add to this, it came on the back of the pandemic, which crushed tourism revenues, and a policy at the same time on the agriculture side, on the organic farming, if I remember, policy side, that destroyed agricultural exports from Sri Lanka, because I remember talking to a few people on the ground over there who were critiquing that policy of the then government. So you start losing forex currencies, and then when people aren't even earning enough money, the economy obviously is under pressure, and then the fuel price hikes come as like the final death knell at that point in time.
Absolutely. I mean, my only point right now that I'm building towards is that there was an economic shock that hit Sri Lanka. That economic shock really took a wrecking ball to people's purchasing power, incomes, employment, and that wrecking ball impacted the ability to buy fuel, to access food, to access energy, and months and months of this destruction eventually led to a point where one 12-hour-long blackout led to people coming out on the streets, marching on the presidential palace. None of this was organized, and that's my second observation. Number one, my third observation. Number one, nobody saw it coming. Number two, there was an economic shock lying behind the sort of popular discontentment that we see exploding onto the streets. Number three, that this was not an organized effort. You did not see, unlike the dharnas of Imran Khan, for example. And I want our PTI friends to take very serious note of this. This was not led by some opposition politicians who arranged gigantic buses, convoys of buses, and bussed large numbers of people in. They were not accompanied by microphones and car-mounted loudspeakers blaring speeches, fueling people's anger and discontentment. There was no protest call given by by a political leader in jail saying come out on the streets, and there was none of that. Number one, and number two, these people, anyway, the fact that it was not an organized effort is important to note. Now, in Bangladesh, too, the economic shock. Now, this is tentative. There are people who know Bangladesh a lot better than me, and I acknowledge that. But nevertheless, in Bangladesh, I do see an employment related shock. And this one takes a lot longer. In Sri Lanka, the shock hits in about a 1 year period. And that's a lot, a 1 year period that, bam, destroys people's purchasing power is a really big deal, and it's a really sudden shock. In Bangladesh, the employment shock I note from about the pandemic onwards. It's there probably slightly before the pandemic, but from the pandemic, when youth unemployment, and especially unemployment among college educated youth, is very, very high, probably the highest it's been in a long time. And it's just not coming down in the years subsequently. It's coming down very, very slowly. And this is causing a larger number of college graduates every year to be added to the roll of unemployed college educated youth. And after years and years of this college educated youth who are unemployed or underemployed, who are scrounging for jobs, comes this highly controversial High Court judgment in Bangladesh, saying that it's perfectly okay for the prime minister to set government quotas in a way that favors where government jobs are given to her favorites and her loyalists. This was, I think, a judgment that had originally come in 2019 that was in fact overturned by the High Court. Now, perhaps a lot of machinations went in between those 5 years, but I think among the people, this was not perceived so much as a court judgment. It was perceived more as a judgment by the regime itself, because the autonomy of the judiciary was no longer something that people over there, at least, were taking very seriously. Um, so there's an economic shock there too, but coming more from the employment side and taking much longer to build up. Um, and then there's a trigger event that hits them specifically on the employment aspect, and the employment-related discontentment that was already building up. And then a very important last observation: in both countries, you have autocratic rulers at the top who have really accumulated all the powers of the state under their own control. So nobody in those countries was now taking the opposition very seriously. You could not take parliament very seriously. You could not take the judiciary very seriously. You could not take the media in those countries very seriously anymore because of the repression brought about on those fronts. And this combination of economic distress below and hardening autocratic tendencies above, this is the critical combination, I think, that lies behind these eruptions, at least in these two countries. I'd be keen to learn from your conversation tomorrow, and to ongoing conversations with you about what was happening in Nepal. Specifically on the economic side, was there an economic component to this? Was there an economic shock, any rising economic distress that is visible in the indicators that we can see in the numbers somewhere? But in time, we'll have time in which to go
Yeah.
through that.
So
The
very quickly
problem
on
here is,
Nepal, if I may
yeah,
add, because two things I've picked up on, right, that were interesting over there. The economic discontent actually was there and was reflected, and a friend of mine pointed this data out in terms of the out migration of Nepali youth looking for jobs abroad. And that's been a dramatic increase over post-pandemic in the country. And this, my friend pointed it out, that a case in point, this is where the discontent was building up. But that was an outlet, right? So people were leaving. And so it was manageable by that standard. Ke theek hai, there's nothing here at home. You go abroad and look for jobs and you escape the system. The second thing that happened more recently was that this trend of online criticism of Nepali Nepo babies, basically. elite children of elite politicians, or the kleptocracy in the country, and criticism of their watches, their lifestyles, their parties abroad, etc. And the trigger so there was discontentment. The Oli government was accumulating power, and the final trigger in this instance was the fact that the Oli government decided that it would not even tolerate dissent online, and therefore would move to ban social media, which the courts complied with. And then everybody came out and said, well, hang on a minute. We're unhappy. We are already trying to escape the country. You're not giving us space to grow. You're not even now allowing us space to voice our discontent, and we're not going to have it. And then the entire system was basically burnt down in a matter of hours. And in Bangladesh and Nepal in particular, the other thing to me that stood out, to add to your very good analysis on this, was that the state repression was there, but after the trigger, the state repression led to the use of live fire ammo that led to deaths on the streets. So Hasina's
Yeah.
police killed people, and then Oli government's police killed people, about 19 on that first day in Kathmandu, if I recall correctly, or more than that now. That has been
Mhm.
confirmed. And that led to just a next level boiling over of anger, because the state decided to not only be autocratic but use weapons and kill people on the street, which again
Mhm.
led to further anger.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong, but when the students initially came out in Bangladesh, came out onto the streets, their demand was not to dismiss Hasina,
Correct. The
right? I
demand
think
was
their
to
demand
reform
was to
the
reverse
job
that
job
decision.
quotas, to reform the job quotas.
Just reverse that decision, right? And had Hasina sort of seen, I mean, this is another thing that happens to rulers in that time when they've accumulated all the powers of the state under their control. A mindset develops that, no one
She,
is,
in fact, in a very now infamous speech at that time, compared the protesters who were demanding reforms of job quotas to conspirators that partnered with Pakistan in 1971. I forget the exact
that's
language
right.
she used, but she used
That's
that in a
right.
speech.
That's right. That's right. That was incendiary, and it also showed the extent to which she had sort of retreated in this mentality that I'm all powerful and I can do anything I want. Um, and during the protests, it's the violence that the state unleashed that caused the protest and that their demands to turn into an uprising, right? And the demands to go from reform the job market, reverse this decision, to remove Sheikh Hasina altogether. And in that, there was one particular moment, I think, where there was where they opened fire. There was one visual where one of the young protesters is seen holding a flag in a video, and he's defiant, and they shoot him. And he gets hit by these bullets, and you see him getting hit, and then his body falls lifeless on the floor. And just by sheer, I'll call it luck, or whatever you want to call it, that moment happened to be captured on video, and that video went viral. And that played a big role in sort of igniting this this really deadly cocktail of discontentment that had now spilled out onto the streets and igniting it into a full-blown popular uprising. That I think Hasina then tried to sort of up the
Yeah.
ante and called out the army. Then she ordered the army to open fire, and at that point, then she was like, "Okay, I think we've." The
Yep.
army itself told her, maybe it's better that
Time's
you
up.
just leave.
Yeah. So now
Yeah,
that we
time's up.
know, the core sort of elements, right? And again, these are not always same to same. They're not apples and apples comparisons. Different countries have their own unique political economies, different geographies, all of that stuff. You allude to this in your piece as well at the end, and that's my last question to you as well. What does that mean for Pakistan? Like, how should Pakistanis, in particular, Pakistani elite policymakers, ought to be thinking about what's transpired in the region and what's going on? And this broader, we've talked about the first half of this podcast, right? That the discontent is there in Pakistan. Purchasing power has been hammered over the last 3, 4 years. What are the lessons here for them from your perspective?
I think the lessons are to take these incidents very, very seriously. Number one, take economic distress very seriously. And I think, you rightly pointed out the inflation of the past 3 to 4 years, the amount of purchasing power that has been destroyed. This is going to take a long time to rebuild. You can't just say, okay, we've brought inflation down, therefore job done. No, it doesn't work like that. You've brought inflation down. All that means is you've put out the fire. Now, rebuilding all that was burnt away during the fire is the long haul job that follows. And for that, you need some kind of shared prosperity taking place, which is not happening right now. With the economy and the state going into the economy stagnant and the state going into over extractive mode, you're not really rebuilding on the ashes of what that inflationary fire left behind. So take economic distress very, very seriously. Number one. Number two, you can repress your way through economic distress up to a point. You can repress a population to withstand and to suffer economic distress, but there's a time limit on that. When you go beyond that time limit, that economic distress itself creates horizontal solidarities, it creates discontentment, which in turn shapes people's understandings of power, of history, of the moment they are passing through in ways that we don't understand. Prolonged exposure of an entire population to inflation, to unemployment, to erosion of their purchasing power, to the various manifestations of economic distress, we don't fully understand how that shapes people's thinking, their moorings to rationality, their tendency to look to conspiracy theories, fake news, and disinfo for the answers to the kind of questions that are forming in their minds, and all these things. That soup that we don't understand that forms in the minds of people lies behind these explosions of anger. In Nepal, they tried to shut down social media sites to what they said control the spread of disinformation and fake news. But where's the appetite for that fake news coming from? You know, and they found out that simply repressing that appetite was not enough. I mean, in fact, it did the opposite. It backfired on them hugely. You can repress your way through economic distress up to a point, but you cannot repress your way through it forever. There ain't enough power in the state for you to keep accumulating it under your belt. You bring the judiciary under your control. You silence the media and told them you will only say things that we allow you to say and keep the discourse within acceptable bounds, bounded reset. You're repressing the operation of the markets, the forex markets, for example. Left, right, and center. Down to the point where I think today in Pakistan, the only centers of civilian politics left in the country are the provincial governments. And now there's talk even of reversing that, reverse the NFC award, take away the resources that these guys are being given. Some people going so far as to say, let's just break up the provinces altogether. Let's have a new constitutional order, blah, blah, blah. This is, you've got to bear in mind, you can repress up to a point, but not past that point in the face of economic distress. And after that, bear in mind, nobody saw it coming. Nobody saw Nepal coming, Sri Lanka coming, or Bangladesh coming. There are no sort of signs that tell you that this is about to happen, other than the fact that the combination of prolonged economic distress with a hardening of the state at the top is a very dangerous combination and should not be sustained for too long.
I think that's very well said. And in fact, since Nepal is still fairly new and we're still trying to figure all of that out, people should also take a look at and read a bit about the economic distress and repression in Egypt pre the Arab uprising there, or in Syria pre the civil war against Bashar al-Assad. There were economic shocks and then repression for all to see in places like Tahrir Square, or in cities like Aleppo. So I think that's very well put, Khurram, that this is not a forever chain. There's a time limit here. And at some point in time, you have to make the decision of reforms, both economic and political, that allow a level of shared prosperity. And on the economic side, it'll take time, 100% agreed. But you can start showing some movement to get people to understand that there is a shared way out of that. And currently, as you've put it in your extracting dollars piece, we are in over extraction mode. And I would argue that, the peak stability that sort of I've been referring to for a number of months now as stable instability, that peak stability has been achieved, in my view. I think now there are a lot of avenues for missteps, constitutional amendments being the key one. And that's what I'm watching out for is, as you said, we can't predict, but there are elements of things that are beginning to happen, at least on the political side, from my perspective, that could light that spark. You see this in the Islamabad High Court, for example, right now, with an open rebellion that I would argue is going on between the justices. Provinces you've alluded to, NFC award you've alluded to, what's going on in terms of dynamics in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa with military operations, and now the floods, which we didn't even talk about in this episode. But the floods in Punjab are another new element there that must be studied. So, as always, always wonderful talking to you, getting your insights, and I think these two pieces combined are a must read. So, as I said, put them in the description. Everyone who listened to this conversation, please do read that because they connect and they're important to know what could be coming next in Pakistan. So, thank you for your time today.
Thanks much.